So let me open this closing session by first mentioning that I've been asked to step in this moderator function for the closing panel because Aurore Lecuq had a problem and had to cancel her participation. So I guess it must be an important issue, I think not too harmful for her, but so it is. You will have to bear with me for this. Now, a closing session is a difficult moment and an important one. When closing, we are tired. We had a lot of interesting discussions. We know we are about to be the moment where this conference will be in the past, and we all want the time we spend here not to be useless and to bear fruits and have consequences. So that's why I thank you for being here, and I think that the energy and concentration that will happen during the next 2 hours are very critical for transforming what has been done in the past days into something useful. The structure will be as follows. We will listen to Georgios Kallis first, who will make a presentation of 15-20 minutes. Georgios is the author of this piece, the petition, I don't know how to call it, he will speak about it, that appeared in The Guardian and Libération and has been signed by more than 200 academics. And then we will have a conversation with the two other panelists who are engaged with this post-growth issue from a different perspective than a research one, the practitioner perspective, I would say. And so we will listen to their thought about how this can move on. And then the parliamentarians who are in the room and who have organized this conference will be asked to share their feedback and takeaway from the conference, and in particular comment the request that has been made in the petition to the European Parliament and to the public institutions. So we will hear them then, and then it will be time to open the debate to all of you. Asking you, so you can prepare maybe already, to share with the other in the room your feedback on the experience of this conference. And I remember the opening by Philippe Lamberts when he said that he wanted this conference to be a dialogue between people who do not necessarily agree, but can exchange argument in respect of each other. So was this a fruitful experience, a painful one? What is your thought about that? And also, of course, your suggestion and recommendations for following up. And I think then it will be time to leave the floor to Philippe Lamberts for some last few words. Okay, with that, I now ask Georgios Kallis to make his presentation. You speak from here, Georgios?
Yeah, I'll speak from here.
Okay, the floor is yours.
If I can see at my slides. Yes, thank you very much. I would like to thank Christophe Lamberts and Olivier Deruin for organizing this event. I think it was a great learning experience for all of us who are here. It is learning, and it's also frustrating, I guess, for both the policymakers who are here and us who are from academia or people who are activists and they have attended the event, because many times we tend to talk across each other, no? Because we don't have necessarily the same language, we don't speak exactly from the same perspective, we don't have the same concerns. So it takes some time, I think, to build this dialogue, but I think it's a very important step to start it. I felt a little bit during these 2 days that perhaps there was a little bit of, not misunderstanding, but I would say it wasn't clear for everyone who is new here, what do we mean when we talk about growth, degrowth or post-growth. There was a letter written and signed by 230 scientists. I didn't write it, but I saw it at its beginning and I contributed to it. And I would like a little bit to go over the core ideas of what do we mean, what's the case that we make when we talk about degrowth, which I think can be a good base for the closing conversation and to see also what we got from these 2 days. Next slide. So what is degrowth, first of all? First and foremost, I would say, is a criticism and a call that we have to stop thinking, but not only stop thinking, but also changing the institutions that demand the constant pursuit of economic growth. So people who talk about the growth, we are very critical about the idea that we need 2 or 3% growth per year, and we are very critical of whoever tries to salvage this idea with different justifications in the name of combating climate change, in the name of combating poverty because of inequality, etc. And we are collecting and we are developing as researchers a lot of arguments on why this pursuit of growth has become not only problematic, but I would say catastrophic. At the same time, degrowth, as a word, signifies a radical social transformation, because our society now is so much based on growth, that if you hear degrowth, you understand that we're talking about something big. No, we're not talking about sustainable development or green growth or circular economy. We're talking about something big that will have also a drastic effect of reduction of resource and energy use. So a lot of our concerns are environmental, but they are not just environmental. Next slide. Yeah. In this talk, I'm going to briefly go over 5 inconvenient facts that make the case for degrowth, why these 2 things that I said are important, why we should abandon the pursuit of growth, and why we should try to radically change society so as to use less energy and resources. I'm going to leave an open question, and then I'm going to very briefly go over the alternative ideas and proposals that we make. Next slide. In the letter, there are 2 key statements at the beginning. We say there is no sign that economic activity is being decoupled from resource use or pollution at anything like the scale required. So the idea that I saw 2 posters outside here in front of the Parliament. No, one was saying we invest to have economic growth in the Union. The other one was saying we combat climate change. We are saying that it's impossible to do both of them. You have to choose one. And if you're serious about what you're choosing, you have to choose combating climate change. The second point, though, that I think interesting, is that growth is becoming harder and harder to achieve. Someone might say if growth is harder to achieve, let's put all our efforts to achieve it. No, that's the current mentality right now. But what we are saying is that at the name of trying to achieve growth at all costs, we are sacrificing society and the environment. It is what some people have called uneconomic growth. So growth right now has more costs than it has benefits, social costs and social benefits I'm talking about. This aggressive pursuit of growth at all costs is becoming detrimental. We are getting even more indebted than we were before the crisis, with quantitative easing, with new bubbles emerging to have growth, and at the same time we are shrinking the welfare state, again, to have surpluses that can go into investments that they can create growth. So we think that right now there is a big problem. There are fundamental reasons why we can't have growth, and instead of trying to adapt and do well and prosper, as Tim Jackson says, without growth, we are squeezing people and we are indebting future generations in order to get 2 or 3% more points at GDP that don't even end up to the people that need it, the workers. Next slide. Let me start by saying that the whole idea of compound growth is an absurd idea. And I'm not talking here because we live in a finite planet. Even if we didn't live in a finite planet, it would still be absurd. Why would it be absurd? Because 3% growth every year means that the quantity doubles every 22 years, more or less. This is just a graph where I plotted how much GDP would have to increase by the end of this century if we were to grow the global economy at 3% per year. This is compared to today. You see where it's 2018, and that's like an exponential growth already. This is where we have to be by the end of the century. So we have to pay attention that this is like the basic policy goal right now of the European Union, of the US, of China, of everyone, is to do this thing. This thing is impossible to happen. It won't happen. And even if it were to happen, it would be catastrophic. Can I have the next slide, please? This is what has happened till now. On the top is like GDP and population, exponential growth already. But nothing like the exponential growth that we want to achieve, not we, I don't, but the majority want to achieve by 2100, no? The other graphs are all graphs of different types of environmental pressures and impacts. It's from fertilizers to ocean acidification, to nitrous oxide, to carbon dioxide, of course, that everyone talks about these days, to all sorts of things. It's vehicles, cars, dams, paper, everything you want gets exactly the same direction. And our idea is that we can't keep doing that until 2100. I'm sorry that we can't keep doing that, and we can't do it without destruction. I'm not talking here about planetary boundaries, that we won't be able to do it. I hope we won't be able to do it, because this thing is catastrophic. Next slide, please. There is the idea that in the European Union we are doing better, we are using less carbon, we are using less resources. To a large extent, this has to do with the fact that we import, it's like a globalized economy now, and we import these goods from the countries that produce them now, the industrial goods. So the red line is how many materials we are using within the European Union, within the borders of European countries. The green line is how many materials are incorporated, resources are incorporated in the goods that we consume. And this, we see that it grows still in line with GDP. We are not dematerializing. We are not decoupling, as it's called, growth from resource use. Resource use grows hand in hand with growth. And this is like really problematic. It's not good for the environment to start with, but it's not also good for the people and the communities who live very close to the places in the other side of the world where we bring these materials to Europe. Next slide, please. There is the idea that somehow we can decouple economic growth from GDP from carbon emissions. And to one extent, Europe has managed to stabilize its carbon emissions and in some countries decline them. But let us start with some basics. The basics, and this is the graph on the upper left-hand side, shows that the wealthier a country is and the higher its GDP, the more carbon it emits. This is like almost a law until now. I mean, it's as good as an econometric relation as it gets. And if you study econometrics or economics, for those of you who are economists, when you find a relation like that, you think you found the truth, no? Somehow in this debate now we say, no, this is truth, but we're going to change it in the future. So then let's stop doing econometrics altogether, I would say, because anything we can change it. I would say rather than saying we can change it, it's like let's focus and see what's happening there. And there is a tight relation that we all know between fossil fuels and growth, which is very hard to break. Very, very hard to break. We hope we can break it. We don't only hope we can break it, but now we start having some new fantasies. The graph on the right-hand side is the scenarios of carbon emissions and how many degrees of climate change we're going to have. Anything above 2 degrees is going to be catastrophic. We are heading now to 4 to 5 degrees. We celebrated in Paris for the agreement, but people who have made an analysis of the pledges of nations in Paris and what they account to 3 to 4 degrees Celsius. That is, if they achieve what they pledged. And some countries, like the US, are already out of their pledges. Okay. IPCC makes scenarios and says we can still go below 2 degrees Celsius. How do they do that? First of all, they have invented a new fantasy, which is that by 2050, somehow we will start absorbing carbon out of the atmosphere, called negative emission technologies, and we're going to be putting it, absorbing it with trees, then we're going to burn these trees, make energy, and then store these emissions of this energy below the earth. That hasn't happened. The people who wrote about it is like they said, this might be a solution, it's a small-scale idea we have right now. We are already saying that by 2050 this is going to happen. That's the only hope we have right now of staying with 2 degrees Celsius of climate change. The other big idea that we have is that we're going to suddenly start decarbonizing our energy system and move to renewable energy. Next slide, please. I'm all for renewable energy, don't get me wrong to that. But the idea that we can have a society that functions as it functions now, with our fast cars, with our airplanes, with moving and going like anywhere we want within a few hours, that we're going to have this society and at the same time have a society that runs on sun and wind, is, I think, it doesn't have any good scientific basis. It doesn't happen at all already, despite all the monumental change we've had in terms of renewable energy. They are just like this very small bit you see up there in terms of the global supply of energy, no? And you see that while renewables are slightly growing, all the other forms of energy are growing. Even biofuels that, you know, we left them behind in the 19th century, charcoal, still has a considerable part of the portion of how much energy we are using. We don't let any energy source we had behind. We're just adding on top of it other sources of energy. And that's what we are doing with renewables to a very small extent. But mostly the reductions you see in carbon emissions in the European Union have to do with a shift from coal to natural gas, which is fine, but it has a limit. You know, you shift to coal, then you use more and more coal, your economy grows, you emit more and more carbon. We want to shift to renewable energies. True, but renewable energies, if we were to employ them at the scale that we think is necessary, first of all, do we have the land for doing all that? We occupy a lot of land. In Greece right now, main conflict of environmental organizations is that windmills are destroying the landscape of the country on the top of mountains in islands. It's not easy also to occupy everything with renewables. And of course, the big problem with renewables is that they are intermittent sources of supply. So you need huge batteries. Again, we have ideas how we might do that, but there's nothing in practice. How are we going to build these huge batteries? Where are we going to do that? How are we going to use like huge dams to store their energy? That's the other big idea. When are all these things going to happen? How much are they going to cost? Are you going to have still growth if you invest in all these other things and you substitute fossil fuels with a source that it's much more diffuse? We like these fantasies, of course, because the later state we can continue going the way we go. But the problem is that we might have to sit back and think whether we can keep going the way we are going. Next slide. So precisely that's what we are trying to do by starting this conversation about post-growth and degrowth. I know that for many people it's really hard to stomach this provocation or this question, because the argument is this is impossible. No one will accept it. Our economies without growth have recession. We know how bad recession is. Of course we know how bad recession is, no? For workers, for weak people, for poor people, for the social state that we all support. We know that we need growth, and we know that no politician right now and no majoritarian political movement would support abandoning growth. Many people are saying no. So the only hope we can have is that somehow we can decarbonize, or somehow in 50 years we're going to start getting carbon out of the atmosphere. Or that somehow we're going to start pouring money now, we're going to start cutting the welfare state, and somehow this is going to create growth and jobs. That's where we start. So there are some people who go in this direction. I can understand them. I can understand why they're going in this direction. But I would say there is a growing community of people, and it's the people we wrote this letter, that we're going on a different direction. We say, stop, and let's start questioning what is happening. Are there other alternatives? Next slide, please. 3 minutes, yeah. And we have other alternatives. On the letter, we write about limits on resource use, progressive taxation, gradual reduction in working time, a carbon tax, which can be returned back to people and workers as dividend, a basic and a maximum income. We have also to tax the rich up to a level, like constant and enrichment without limits also doesn't make sense within a limited planet. Next slide. What I saw also in this conference is that we don't have a lack of ideas, no? There are people who have written and have done good research about working time. There are people who have done very good research about how we can change the monetary system, how we can create money not as debt that then demands growth in order to be repaid, but how to create it and directly direct it to the economy through fiscal expenditure. There are people who have written about maximum wage. There are people who have written about basic income, etc., etc. One criticism I have to some conversations I heard here on these issues is that sometimes they are not thought in an overall integrated frame of a transition. No? They are thought as correctives to what's happening right now. So I hear about basic income because there are poor people. No, not basic income because there are poor people, but basic income because we want to liberate people from a market economy that has to grow, and this growth is catastrophic. Basic income because people are workers and they contribute to everything around, and they deserve a minimum share, a basic dignified share of the total thing that is being produced by their work too. Not basic income just because there are poor people and there is a recession and we hope that we give them money and then they start consuming more and the economy starts growing again. Next point. And something that wasn't so much reflected here, but it's part of the conversations we are having in the degrowth community. And by these conversations, I mean we have international conferences. This event is also part of the events we have been co-organizing, but every 2 years we have a big international conference where we bring together researchers, activists, policymakers, people who work in the administration, and we discuss about what can be done differently, the question mark that I put there. And we're not discussing only about policies, but we're discussing of how could society look differently, And this cannot be just an utopian thinking of how could things be different, but we study and we look at things that they are already happening now, and they are different, and they could carry the seed of something different. From community currencies and consumer cooperatives to urban food gardens, eco-villages, co-housing projects, hacker spaces where people produce new technologies, all these sort of, within quotation marks, alternative things, alternative economies, that they are happening right now, and they carry the seed of something new. I heard someone ask in a presentation before, he said, we moved from the agricultural to the industrial society, now we have to move to something new that we don't know what it is. So we're trying to imagine by studying what this new that might come and might be sustainable might look like. Last slide. So the last slide is that I don't want to say that any of the things or any of these proposals or any of these alternatives that we are studying is a silver bulletproof, no? We wouldn't say that we have the solution to the dramatic reduction that we have to do and the dramatic change in our lifestyle if we are seriously to go to zero carbon, for example. The dramatic changes we have to do if we are to have an economy, to transition to an economy that won't depend on growth and will have different systems. I'm not saying that any of this is easy. It's not easy politically. Many of these solutions might not work. They might backfire. They might have negative effects. They might be taken up in different ways in different historical situations. And of course, the most important thing is how do they articulate? How do they come forward? What political opportunities do we see? So we are full of questions, but I think this is the debate to be had, and it's important that we started having at least part of this debate here in the European Parliament. Thank you. Last slide.
So thank you very much, Georgios, for this substantial, structured, and meaningful input. I think it's a very good start for this closing session, and I suggest you keep your comments, questions for the second part of the session, and that we now start the conversation with both Gerhard and Carlos, who come from the business world, I would like to ask you first to tell us why you did accept to come to this conference and speak in this post-growth conference. So what does this theme trigger in you so that you chose to be here?
Okay. May I start?
Yes.
I am Gerhard Huemer from EUAPME, the European Craft and SME Association. And I'm here so part as representative of SMEs at European level and part as an economist who is working and thinking about these concepts for a long time, because my economic and political socialization started with the Club of Rome in the 70s. And one of the first papers I wrote in university was about other concepts than GDP as measurement for welfare at our economy. I am quite sure that I have not been invited to push forward the post-grow agenda, but this would be the task of the SMEs. But I'm here also because I'm super convinced that the debate about well-being, about degrow, about reducing resources, and looking at boundaries is of utmost importance for economic policy developments.
And do you feel torn apart between the man and the citizen on the one hand and the representative of SME on the other, or you see this
No,
can go
I
together?
think there's not so much difference between an SME and a normal person working in an SME or getting social support, etc., etc. The problem with post-grow, and this is the reason why I don't buy this concept of post-grow, is that to increase the well-being of people, you need products and services. I fully agree that in the current definition of GDP, there are also services and products in which are not contributing to well-being. But everything what contributes to material well-being is also part of the growth concept.
Okay.
So we are very much interested in all developments to reduce the resource intensity, to develop into a service society, because we know already what the society, economic after the industrial society is. And this is the reason why I'm really, really interested in this concept. And I really warn, in a democratic society, who should decide what is enough? What is enough for people, for poorer people in Europe? What is enough for people in Africa?
Okay.
Etc. When we have to stop growing because they don't need any more of material welfare, then we are very, very fast in a debate about not democratic systems anymore. This is the interest in the debate.
Okay. And you, Carlos, can I ask you, so why you accepted to come here?
To this trap.
Not only accept, but chose to devote time. Why is it important for you?
I am here representing the Club of Rome, which has been mentioned tens of times. So the answer to the question is, well, it's obvious. Somebody had to talk in name of the Club of Rome. And but I will elaborate a little bit more the answer, because the Club of Rome started 50 years ago. So probably many of you, I mean, you are, fortunately there are a lot of young people in the room, so probably many of you don't know much about the Club of Rome. It started as a group of thinkers from different domains, from business, politics, research, activism, trying to ask better questions. I many times say that our role is to ask better questions. And what does that mean? What did that mean at that time, 50 years ago? And it still means the same thing. Trying to ask questions for the world at large, from a global perspective, for the whole of humanity, and not only humanity, the whole of life. Asking questions from a systemic perspective, holistic perspective, taking into account that we are all interconnected to each other, that what is defining life is interdependencies, and asking questions about different timescales, not only what will happen tomorrow, next month, next year, but maybe in 50 years from now or in some centuries from now. And we continue to do that 50 years later. In the context of this conference, so it's obvious from the work we started promoting and publishing the Limits to Growth report, we are in this debate on post-growth since the very beginning, right? What does it mean now, in particular for me? We face a challenge as humanity, a challenge which can be expressed as, right now, an oxymoron, a contradiction, which is how do we achieve high well-being at low footprint? High well-being at low ecological footprint. That's the question for everybody on Earth and for life at large. That's an oxymoron nowadays. If you look at what my colleagues of the club from the Global Footprint Network do, Mathis Wackernagel and William Rees, you can see that if you if you make a graph with countries distributed in terms of well-being or human development index, for instance, versus their ecological footprint, high well-being at low footprint is nowadays an oxymoron. If you have high well-being, you have high footprint. If you have low footprint, you have low levels of well-being. And no country, is in the magic box of what we call sustainable development, which is achieving high well-being at low footprint. Where do we go from here? Asking better questions is also asking why are we still at this point 50 years later and even centuries later, because the first questions about this topic were asked much before the Club of Rome and much before others, people in the ecological movement started. Why are we still here? Is a good question.
Maybe the next one.
Yeah, no, but let me finish. Just my point that we are at a bifurcation point. We are, in a way, we are gridlocked at a critical point, and we have two ways ahead. One way leads to disaster and to suicide of humanity, not to killing the planet, not to killing life, to killing ourselves. This is not the branch we want to take. The upper branch of the bifurcation, we don't know how to take it, but it should lead to the reconciliation of this idea of high well-being and low footprint, to the reconciliation of beauty and truth, the beauty of our dreams and the truth of our limits. And I will continue later.
Thank you, Carlos. So maybe on the second question, we go the other way around. So Carlos finish, and then we come back to you, Gerhard, and we'll do for the third. The second question is, can you give an example of a situation where you thought recently this should not have happened? It is not right. And or a second one, if you have, of something that instead shows the way forward, where you thought, oh, that's going well.
Yeah, I will answer two things to the first. One obvious is climate change.
But I mean a precise decision. You know, not. I think we spoke a lot about what goes wrong in general.
Well,
where you.
There are many precise decisions which took us into the mess in which we are regarding climate change. You know.
Yeah, I don't think it's a
but I will answer that. Yeah. Do you know when the first solar energy machine was invented and developed and it worked? Do you have any idea of when was that? It was in 1850. 1850. So a precise decision. We decided to go for oil and other fossil fuels instead of solar energy. And another answer to the same question is about the fact that in the last 30 years, if you look, we are talking about growth, post-growth, growth of GDP, but there are other magnitudes which are growing and whose growth is in a way concerns me. And one is the fact that the financial assets in the world, that means financial debt, has grown in the last 30 years 3 times faster than GDP, due to a particular decision or a series of decisions related to deregulation of financial markets and globalization, etc. So what we are doing is to burning the future. The least renewable of all resources is time, our future time, and we are burning it through debt. Something which is going in a different direction, I would say, and that we don't notice it so much, but that's quite positive, and I think we should focus on that, is to a certain extent cultural change. So cultural change is not published, is not done by governments, is not published in decrees or in laws, etc., but it happens anyway. And when you see that, for instance, in the US, for many people of younger generations, owning a car is no longer the fashionable thing, is no longer cool. That points to a significant cultural change, and that gives hope.
Thanks, Carlos. And you, Gerhard, these 2 questions, please?
I also want to do very shortly 2 negative developments. And one is a little bit related to what Carlos said, is the decision in the 80s to liberalize global capital markets have led to a situation where Europe has no possibility anymore to effectively control capital markets. And this has a lot of consequences you have discussed the last 2 days. The problem here is that most of the proposals we see from the other side, how to get rid of this situation, also has its shortcomings, because we have to be aware that capital markets are very important to allocate investments in an effective way and in the right direction. So we have to, if we change or if we get rid of the capitalism, we have to think about who else should decide in which investment should be taken. And we have seen other systems in the past which have not succeeded with this decision. Second example is the way in most of the European countries we subsidize renewable energy. Because in many of these countries we developed support systems, subsidized systems, which are in the end of the day paid by small enterprises and by private households, and the big users of energy are exempted from this system. And this is a point which happened in other areas too, and you have before here a discussion with my friends from Business Europe, which also sometimes say they represent small enterprises, which is maybe not fully true in everyday life. But we have to be more careful when we do decisions that not only looking what it means for Apple and Facebook, not only what it means for big players in the industry, but also what is the impact on normal households and the small enterprises, because here there are a lot of unintended consequences which goes in the wrong direction.
Okay.
Positive, I would say, is the way the European Union has handled the policy to improve energy efficiency in Europe, especially those parts where it is in the close dialogue with the stakeholders, and not only with industry, also with us, with the trade unions, with environmental organizations, say how we can go forward to push the energy efficiency standards, but without kicking sectors out of the market.
Okay.
So here to
So
be careful. Yeah?
There is a tension, of course, between what we have heard from Georgios and what you say there. We will not empty that now, but let's say that we hear there is disagreement there. Now, the third question, and that I will propose that Georgios also answers that. So what does it take, in your opinion, to move now in the right direction? How can we make it happen?
The more obvious thing is, and the easier equitable thing for politicians is, we have to invest as much as possible in research and innovation to reduce, to increase the efficiency of resource use, of energy use, etc., to reduce the resource intensity of well-being.
So subsidizing research.
No, yeah, subsidizing or financing, public financing them, also supporting innovation, also go in the direction. We have to get better. Yeah? If we are not able to reduce, we have to. Yeah. I'm not accepting the argument that growth cannot be less resource
That's your point.
using it now.
Okay.
That's the point.
Thank you. So maybe Georgios, and then
maybe we'll have more time to discuss later why I think this point is important, and I would support it. But as I said in the presentation, ideas, there are many, and we heard some of them here. I would say in terms of climate change, which is not the only problem, it's a big one, but it's not the only one, I would say we have to seriously think how to stop extracting fossil fuels, start from the source of the problem rather than all the correctives at the other end. In terms of economic policy, we have to think about how to change the monetary system, and there are good ideas there. But I feel a little bit insincere if I say that that's the direction to go toward, because we know that right now there's no dynamic to go in this direction, so then it would sound a little bit easy words. So I would say, first of all, is to build the movement of people and the movement of people who are involved in political roles, that they have the power and the energies and the support to bring this type of ideas forward.
Thank you. Carlos, please.
I think if we want to go out of the bifurcation through the upper branch, what I call reconciling beauty and truth, there is no way but taking the bull by the horns, and the bull is the intellectual foundations of our society, of our perceptions of the world, of our understanding of reality. The mental frameworks we are using, even without knowing we are using them, but who frame how we think and how we act and how we don't take care too many times, of the consequences of our acts. In that respect, and we discussed that very much in Come On, which is a book we published, collective work led by the two co-presidents of the club, Ernst von Weizsäcker and Anders Wijkman, but where 35 of us, we collaborated, and it was published last year. Come On has to be taken in the different meanings of the expression in English. And part of that is about reviewing the intellectual foundations of our civilization. And in particular, the fact that something which was important in physics in the 18th century but is now well known of limited applicability in physics, that is classical mechanics, the ideas behind that, reductionism, rationalism, linear thinking, that we have to overcome that and go deeper into thinking of ourselves in interdependency with the whole world. And that's already done. I mean, I'm not talking about something new thinking that has to be elaborated from scratch. That it already exists, but we don't take care of that. And that type of thinking makes that we think in silos, that was mentioned today, that organizations, human organizations, whether administrations or companies or whatever, are organized, that the topics are not disconnected. One topic is not disconnected from one another, but we still cheat ourselves in thinking that they can be disconnected. No longer. We have to address complexity with complexity.
Okay, so really change the foundation of how we think and what makes sense. Thank you, Carlos. So now is the moment maybe where I'd like to ask the member of European Parliament who were the organizers, who are the organizers and who are in the room, if they want to share with the audience. Yes, hello. Mrs. Scott-Cato, share your and answer maybe to the recommendation that were done. So I can read them for those who don't know these, or you want to do it yourself. It's your text. The recommendation are constitute a special commission on post-growth futures in the EU Parliament, incorporate alternative indicators into the macroeconomic framework of the EU and its member states. 3, turn the Stability and Growth Pact into a Stability and Well-being Pact. And 4, that's for member states, establish a ministry for economic transition. Could be a portfolio for a commissioner as well. But, okay, so there are these 4 recommendations. So, Mrs. Scott-Cato, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can I start with some reflections of my own?
Of course.
Thank you very much.
You're free.
Yes, I know we're only listening, but it would be nice to be able to do that.
Push it.
It's pushed. Can't use my own microphone. Thank you. So I'm going to have to start with something political, because obviously I've been a Green politician for a long time. I've stood for all these things. I know that here in the Parliament democracy matters a lot. The D'Hondt system controls everything from how long you speak in the Parliament to what rapporteurships you get, how much power you have. I know that people are not putting climate change at the top of their list when they're voting. And that is why we have politicians, most of the politicians are on the right. We have politicians in this Parliament who act as rapporteurs who have actually denied the existence of climate change. That happened this month. And I, battled that and so on. But politics really matters because it's the distribution of power. And so I think one of the things we have to do is to encourage people to think about climate change and who will represent them best on that when they're voting. I also saw those posters coming in yesterday morning, and I thought the same as you. You can't tackle climate change and have economic growth. But then I thought actually what those posters are saying is these are all the different things the people of Europe think when they're voting. And I think that's actually what they were telling us. And people are completely inconsistent and they have a whole bag of different things they want. And that's the problem for the politician. You're moderating constantly between all those different demands. And unfortunately, if you look at the list of people's priorities, climate change is not near the top. It should be right at the top. We all know that. But that's something we all have to do. And I think we have to work more closely with journalists on that. And one thing we've achieved in Britain this summer is, I know this should have happened years ago, but basically the BBC has been continually putting out climate change deniers. So basically the debate in terms of the public service broadcasting is between somebody who doesn't think climate change is happening and somebody who does think climate change is happening. This is like something that should have stopped 30 years ago. But anyway, we all signed a letter to The Guardian, always a great thing to do, saying we were no longer going to join a discussion if there was a climate change denier there. And within 2 weeks, the BBC changed their policy, so their guidelines now say they do not challenge whether climate change is happening. So letters to The Guardian sometimes have an effect. Let's hope your one has a good effect as well. I wanted to come back to what you said, Georgis, about basic income and what justifications we use for that, because I think basic income matters because it's going to change the interaction with the labour market, and I support it for the reasons you support it. It's an important plank of the degrowth agenda. But I might argue for it on the basis that there are poor people, precisely because I'm using it as a transitional demand, right? And I think in a context where most people are not voting on the basis of degrowth or climate change, proposals that we can make which make sense within this paradigm that most people are still living within, which is the growth paradigm, are sometimes a more efficient way of getting the changes that we need to achieve. So your questions, what should not have happened? The most egregious thing that's happened this year is the investment in the Trans-Anatolian pipeline by the European Investment Bank. I mean, I'm like the least popular person with Werner Hoyer now, because everywhere he goes, I tell him they shouldn't have invested that money. But we put billions, I can't remember how many billions, into a pipeline that locks us in to fossil fuels coming across, from Azerbaijan, actually, of all places. How the hell did that happen? If people really want to stop those things happening, looking at what happens in the EIB, they're having a review of their policy this year. We're putting public money, locking ourselves into climate change. But what's been a good thing, on the other hand, I think, is the sustainable finance agenda, which I've worked on quite a lot. I'm not convinced that that's being put forward for the reasons we want it to be, but we need to colonise it because it's a really important initiative. And I said this before, but I would really encourage people to investigate what's happening there, because we're now defining what is sustainable activity in the Economics Committee here in the Parliament. And I think that's, as somebody who's a professor of green economics, that is a really important development, that's now happening in the economic sphere, not in the environment sphere. So on your proposals, Special Commission on Post-Growth Futures, there have been quite a few of those at different levels. I don't think that's the most important thing. I don't think a commission is the most important thing. We could think about how that might be structured, but I'm not sure I'm not sure a room where people talk to each other is the most important intervention, but let's think about that. Alternative indicators. This is a difficult one because I don't think we should start with growth and then tack on other indicators, right? I think we should be saying, and I've heard quite a lot of people here say, actually, the size isn't what matters. What we should be looking at, I think we should be redefining indicators, actually, rather than adding on sort of satellite indicators. So then the Stability and Wellbeing Pact, 100% for that. We'll have to see what we can do about that in various committees, going back to my first point, which is that we have 8.3% as Greens of the members here, and I'm not sure how many others would be up for that, but we can certainly try. We've got other MEPs possibly in the room who can tell me that their groups will support that as well. Ministry for Economic Transition, I think every member state should have one of those, and we should probably have something similar at the European level that coordinates their work and shares best practice. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know, I was told maybe Helmut Scholz would, yes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and I also want to share some reflections from our workshop, which I found very lively and interesting and challenging. And we made a Slido questionnaire to all the participants in the rooms and in the web-streamed auditory maybe. What should members of the European Parliament strive for in the next months and years coming ahead? And the question of should they strive for growth of GDP? The answer was 0%. Of joint EU-wide economic, social, economic policies and progress, 60%. And tackle climate change before economic development, 40%. So this is already a certain picture showing what is expected from politicians here in this House. Fossil fuels need ranged planned phase out for the benefit of renewable energies, and social economies needs planned growth. 86% agreed and 40% disagreed. And finally, that all the 14 SDGs should be put into the focus of the acting. There was a favor of 67% and others 33%. What I want to describe with these figures, because it shows a certain development of the discussion within the societies. We are coming from the society, so there is no differentiation between those who are occasionally elected into this European Parliament by certain majorities their parties got in all the 28 member states. But we have to transport through the European Parliament these opinions from people into the decision-making processes. And answer your question, I would suggest that, and answering also what if the three proposals from the scientists should be picked up, I would say task, challenge number one should be that we are putting the beyond growth awareness and the 17 SDG aims into the benchmark in all horizontal programs which we are dealing from the budget, so the international trade issues, negotiations we are having and concluding in agreements, from the employment policies to the environment policies and the development and industry policies. So if we as parliamentarians are able within the next years to do so, we can contribute to fulfill the task all our nations have agreed on till 2030 to implement the 17 aims of the SDGs. So 12 years are remaining. So what we are doing in reality, we are putting the questions rightly as economists today, yesterday and all the 2 days have put together in the reality or not? Or just we are talking on this issue? No, we have to act. And if we want to act, then I think we can wait for a new commission we establish. No, that's too long. I think we have already today to introduce these proposals, these thoughts into the political agenda. And therefore our workshop was quite, I would say, interesting and controversial, because we had the theory of the economy of the commons from Christian Felber, vice versa, the representative from the Commission, the General Director of the Employment Unit. And that means how we combine this. How we can economy of commons introduce in the current economic policy carried out by the Commission on behalf of the Council. So it is finally a question about democracy. Do we are really interfering in this? And do we let the Council behave as the Council is behaving all the time, even against, as you said, Molly, a conservative majority in this House? But nevertheless, in this House, we have an awareness about the necessities to change our attitudes. And therefore, I think it's also the democratic task to ourselves to introduce what we have learned together here in the next days also into the policy, as a further policy addresses in the European Parliament, vice versa the Commission, and vice versa the Council. And we are discussing the next multi-annual financial frame. Okay. That means we are deciding about where the money is going for. Do we are giving more money into the question of really coming to the climate change challenges, in post-growth awarenesses, in new approaches, or we do give the money into the military issues, in the defense sector, increasing the borders, etc., to neglect the necessity to restructure our economy. So, I mean, this must be, this discussion of our 2 days conference must be a benchmark for the discussion of the next multi-annual financial frame, the years 2020-27. Maybe I'm stopping here and can only include all of you. Interfere into this democratic making awareness, vice versa the politicians. Thank you for coming and having the chance of sharing your views with others as politicians here in the European Parliament.
Does Philippe Lamberts wants to say something at this point?
I think I'll have the floor later at the end, so maybe you should ask Kathleen or...
Yeah, okay. Kathleen is there? I'm sorry, yeah, okay. Yes, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. I'll try to be brief. I have to say, when Philippe asked me...
Maybe introduce yourself for those...
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm Kathleen van Bremt. I'm S&D Vice President for the S&D working on sustainability. And when Philippe asked me to join, to organize with other colleagues under the leadership of Philip, this conference. I immediately said yes. It was under a coffee in Strasbourg. I immediately said yes because I think it is the time now to discuss this issue, post-growth. It's more than climate alone. I heard a lot about climate, and you don't have to convince me how extremely important that is. But for me, it's more than climate. It is about the wide range of sustainability. You can call it the sustainability goals, or the wide range of sustainability. For me, and I think for a lot of people, it fundamentally includes the fight against inequalities. And more than that, the linkage between the climate issues and the inequalities. That is extremely important for me. Combating climate change is in essence also a social combat. And that's why post-growth discussions are so important. And I have to tell you, the petition and the text with it was on the front page of De Morgen, which is one of the leading newspapers in the Flemish part of Belgium, was on the front page and then a little bit further. And immediately, the day after, all the prominent economists of Flanders, and we have some, they all came into the newspaper explaining that we need growth, and you cannot tackle the concept of growth, but of course we need to, and then the rest came. That was really interesting to see. So it's the time to put it on the top of the political agenda. I would still urge us to think deeply about the wording that we use, because I saw that in the discussions in the working groups. Some would like to call it degrowth or post-growth, and let's not make the mistake and talk about degrowth. Why? Because growing is something very beautiful. You want to see your kid grow, you want to see a tree grow, and we need to conquer the hearts of the people. And then words are important. It's not about not shrinking. We don't want to shrink. It's about a completely different model in our economy. Why is the problem growth today? Because it's based on the GDP. And it's the GDP that is the problem. And that's been in the news, in the letter as well, and that is what we need to tackle. And one of the key things to do is the governance issues here at the European level. And let me tell you, we all are privileged to be able to work, live, and be politically active in Europe. And I'm sorry, I know there are few people from the US, but be aware of that, because we are the one and only continent where you have a lot of support from the locals and within your communities. And there's a lot of initiative coming from that. But we also have in Europe still, although we have a lot of differences and we do not go as fast as we should, there's a lot of support also from the top level, the European level. And we also need to give people hope. And if you look to what's happening in Europe, the good news is it's going in the right direction. We are having discussions now on the CO2 of cars. Look at it, the coming days. And the good news is it goes in the right directions. The bad news is always it does not go fast enough. And why is that? And that's, again, post-growth. Think about the fundamentals. Is because the fundamentals are wrong. And in that sense, the suggestions are welcome, and I think we need to build a majority now in the Parliament to start discussing the European semester and help me, the global, the Stability and Growth Pact, sorry.
Growth and stability.
Yeah. Because every year when we give recommendation at the European level to the national member states, it's only based on budgetary rules. And it's never based, or hardly based, or not hard based, on what should be the Sustainable Development Goals and the climate issues. And there we need to change. I would not go for a special committee in the European Parliament because we have a lot of special committees, and I would go into the heart of the lawmaking committees and make standing rapporteurs in these lawmaking committees and try to make the difference over there. But I have to wrap up.
Thank you.
But I just want to thank all of you for being here and giving us your ideas.
So So thank you all. I'm struck by the fact that the insistence on wording, on foundations, come more and more often, so that we realize that knowledge is something that stands on top of something else, which is acting below and may well be what we need to really change. And I want to bring, before opening the floor to the audience, to get your feedback and suggestion, and then give the panel a round of reaction in the end. But let me make a comparison between John Stuart Mill and what she said about the subjection of women in one point, because I think the only unease I have when, in environmental terms, we say that everything is going wrong, it has to be said that for equality between men and women, things have gone better over these 200 years. So, but here, it's interesting to see that John Stuart Mill was writing in this, the subjection of women, the principle that regulates the existing social relations between the two sexes, the legal subordination of one sex to the other, is wrong itself, and is now one of the chief obstacles to human improvement. So I think it's easy to paraphrase and to say the principle that regulates the existing political realm, I would say, the overarching centrality of growth, is wrong itself, and is now one of the chief obstacles to human improvement. So we can learn from how he did to think about how we can change that. And so he says two things. One is the problem, rather the difficulty, is one that exists whenever something is being defended against a mass of feeling. Just because the opposing views, those who don't think the way, so those who think that the legal subordination is right, he says, this is strongly rooted in feelings. It's psychologically strengthened rather than weakened by having the weight of argument go against it. If it were accepted as a result of argument, counter-argument might shake the solidity of the conviction. But when it rests solely on feeling, arguments against it don't shake it at all. So that's a question of recognizing also that this growth addiction is not just economic science, it's what else in all what we experience makes growth so compelling, I would say, and how to debunk that. And the second, so those who attack an almost universal opinion, but now the question of growth, and notably thanks to the Club of Rome, is also widespread. And I think more widespread than was those fighting for gender equality in the 18th century. But still it says that those who want to displace such an opinion are faced with difficulties all the way. They have to be very lucky, one, and unusually able, so that's for us, able if they are to get a hearing at all. It is harder for them to obtain a trial than it is for any other litigants to obtain a verdict. And if they do get a hearing, it subjects them to a set of logical requirements totally different from the ones imposed on the other side. So that's also, of course, the privilege of the default position, I would say, and the difficulty of those who want to really bring a change. So that's the challenge which is before us, and I think that's important to remember that displacing growth in the role it plays in public policies and public debate is an issue that goes well beyond both environment and economics, and that can help economists also to do. So with this slight comment, I am happy to open the floor and ask the panelists and Philippe Lambert to really take track of all what is said. So, yeah, I look at the fingers and, voilà. Yes, if I may, yeah, here, 1, 2, yeah, so, yeah, go, yeah, okay. There, the lady with the glasses, please. And, yeah, I've seen you, yeah. You push the button. I think the camera, and should go on you.
Hi.
Yeah.
Okay. This is, I'm Mira Ghani. I represent community-led initiatives with the platform called Ecolis. What I'd like to hear and what I found missing in the discussions here was we're talking about the indicators, we're talking about how to develop alternatives. We're talking about alternatives that already exist. But we're not talking about growth as a system. And I know some have alluded to capitalism and the economic models and things like that. But also, whenever you look at systems and do a systems analysis, you do an initial analysis of who benefits from the system and who loses out from the system. And this is something that I find missing in a lot of the discussions today. So anyone, I'd be happy to hear from any one of the panelists to answer. Thanks.
Thank you. Can you raise your hand again? Yeah, I go there. The man, yeah, please.
Okay, thank you for this fantastic conference. It has been a wonderful experience. I would like, however, to give a little bit of support to this point that was just made. When we study what actually has been happening to neoliberalism, we see that it's really an incredibly adaptive and intelligent system that has moved from roll backwards to roll forwards to roll with to austerity. And so we can expect that neoliberal forces will somehow try to use the knowledge that is produced here for their program. And I didn't see that being discussed yet. But however, I've seen something happening, which is, for example, some aspects of neoliberalism coming to the discussion here. An example happened very recently in which someone was talking about we need to put caps on growth and on use of CO2. But of course that those who can pay can benefit from a little bit more this. And I find that a profoundly neoliberal discourse that is already appearing here. Mm-hmm. I also can imagine a form of austerity, a kind of a post-growth austerity appearing as a result of these kind of ideas. And I find that dangerous, and is certainly what we don't want to happen. And so I really like to see some kind of contribution here, some perhaps from yourself, on how, the Commissioner, yourself, yes, about how could this perhaps be prevented? What can be done to prevent this colonization of this discourse?
Now we're here to harvest your ideas. So, by the way, I think when you take the floor, maybe just announce, is it a comment, a question, or a wish for the follow-up so that we can directly see what it's about?
It's a wish for a follow-up.
A wish for a follow-up. And can you, in one word, and say what the wish for the follow-up was about?
How can we prevent neoliberalism to colonize the post-growth discourse?
Okay. We take it. Yes, please. Yeah.
This is a comment. I think there's a great danger of moving away from the term degrowth. I would find it a terrible shame if we abandoned that term for public relations reasons. And I even think it's a little bit questionable to move to post-growth, because post-growth doesn't mean degrowth. It could be just no more growth. But I think it's important to remember what it is that degrowth always wanted to degrow, and that is throughput, not necessarily well-being or GDP, but it's just the inputs and outputs from nature into nature. So I think there's a danger here. I think degrowth became very strong and popular because it was honest. I think we should stay honest, that we see that this has to degrow.
Okay. So, yes, please.
Hello. Sorry. I'm François Schneider. I was actually in the European Parliament 10 years ago to try to convince to make conferences on degrowth. And I think it's amazing, like all the path that has been done. But I really can say that, well, the growth narrative is the growth institutions are very, very sticky. But like it's moving on. I would like to say two things. First, that we focus very, very much on climate change. I want to say that the idea is being degrowth. Why we want, there is a problem with growth, and why we want degrowth. There's many more reasons. It's like justice, conviviality, the relations between people, like the availability of resources, the democracy, to be able to actually decide to be at scale where we can actually decide things, the well-being, like living simplicity, There is also ecology. On ecology, there's many parameters around ecology. One of them is climate change. So it's like not only about climate change. And also, my wish would be really, and that was my hope, and I hope it's going to move, that policymakers could sit around the table, ready to sit around the table, to build like a new story with all the wealth of alternatives that Jorgo was describing. There are really many people working on alternatives, and we don't manage to include policymakers on the table on an equal level to actually build a new story. And it would be very important if it's one day possible.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yes, thank you, Nick Mann from the European Environmental Bureau. It was a great speech, Georgios. I don't think anyone can walk out of this room thinking that we can still grow the economy and tackle the climate breakdown. I've heard today a lot of people asking, well, what can we do? And I've also heard Monica Scott Cato saying that, don't forget, it's a political struggle as well. And the elections are coming up. So what we can do now is influence party manifestos. Parties are making up their programs now. Why don't we send this open letter to our politicians in our country, asking them for a reaction, like, what are you going to do with it, as you're writing your party manifesto? And of course, you can sign up to it. Already 3,200 people signed this petition, and I can guarantee you we're going to use this and remind the Commission time and again of there is support for this. It's not a niche thing. There are people who want this. So please go to wemove.eu/postgrowth and sign the petition. And don't stop there. Contact your politicians and ask for a reaction. Thanks.
Okay. Yes, yes, please.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello, I'm Christine Lang. I'm studying economics and sociology in Germany. I had the impression, and that's a comment and as well a wish for the ongoing, that all the commissioners at least I have heard in the last 2 days, we're speaking about sustainable growth or green growth and not about degrowth. And I think that's a really crucial point, that the audience was speaking sometimes a different language than the panel, because the one we're speaking about green growth and the others assume that a decoupling between economic growth and carbon emissions isn't possible. So we couldn't really discuss, for example, financial regulation if the one people are speaking about green growth and others assuming that decoupling is impossible. So I think for the ongoing, it would be really good to summarize all the information the degrowth movement has about decoupling and spread it to the commissions so that we kind of speak on the same basis. That's the one really, for me, important point I want to make. And the other one is that I really appreciated this conference, and I hope there will be another chance to have such a discussion between politicians and the movement. But for next time, I would really like to have the degrowth perspective on the panel as well, because it was quite difficult to ask questions and to make comments at the same time from an audience perspective. So, I would really like to have the degrowth perspective on the panel next time.
We will. So we shall turn back to the panel at 20 to 6. So you know, please. Voilà. May I just send back on growth or degrowth? What about this expression of Kate Raworth's growth agnosticism? That is, I don't know, no, but I want to say focus on something else that may result in being less obsessed. Because we heard, I love the sentence by you saying that trade-off is to be abandoned, and behind a trade-off there is always a judgment. But I would say that the modern way of discussing is colonized by either a trade-off, which is not good, or sterile opposition, which also is not good. So should we fight on growth, degrowth, or degrowth, post-growth, or agree that maybe we should just look at, go by other goals and benchmark as a whole? But sorry for this interjection. Now, I was looking for women. Voilà. Good. Sorry, and the men will get that.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Ana Margarida Esteves, University Institute of Lisbon. I was really happy to see that colleague Georgios Kallis referred to REPAS and the social solidarity economy movement. I believe it's about time that we frame these topics of degrowth and sustainability or post-sustainability thinking in a wider frame, and we approach it systemically. Why is it so difficult to promote organizational forms, especially in the field of in the fields of entrepreneurship, production, trade, and so on? Why is it that, for example, permaculture projects remain so local, so isolated, and are still seen as so marginal? Isn't it time that we actually start looking at, health and safety rules, all those rules which are created by the states, first at the which are created by the states and also and nowadays, first of all, at the European level, and which so much constrain.
Is it a suggestion that come in?
It's a suggestion, okay. Yes. And which constrain what we can call the economic and entrepreneurial imagination, issues of health and safety rules, issues of rules for public procurement and so on, which lead to situations in which organizations and economic initiatives which go against the grain of, for example, against the growth paradigm, and which represent new post-capitalistic and post-growth forms of economic behavior, find it so difficult to be sustainable in the current system. Yes. Yes, if I have a couple of examples, or would you like to... examples that would like to... Yeah. Examples,
So Mrs. Yeah.
Small cooperatives, for example. Okay. And also, that's an example. The rules that stop them doing that, that's a long story. I think it's better to have a private conversation.
Okay.
Sure.
Yeah.
But rules of public procurement, safety, the red tape needed to create a business and to have it part of the formal economy. Mainly that. Red tape. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, I have a lot. Yeah. Anyway, this side, sorry, please go, be as punchy and sharp and short as possible.
So I'll try to be punchy. I think one of the major blind spots of the conversations, at least in my experience that have gone on, is the question of power, because there are organizations whose objective material interests are directly opposed to solving the climate crisis, big oil, agro-industry, the auto industry, and the big banks that support them, and they are the ones that hold power. And you can take historical examples of, what decisions that were made that led us to this mess in the first place. Typically, the generalization of the car as the dominant mode of mobility, that was a deliberate strategy adopted by the auto industry in the 30s that has been very well documented, that they broke down collective transport in cities. Or typically Coca-Cola switching from glass bottles and consignments to plastic bottles, leading to the explosion of plastic. These were deliberate strategies put forward by companies and that have been able to impose their interest in front of the common good. So I think something that is important to keep in mind in these conversations, that if we are serious about solving the climate problem, we can no longer shy away from engaging in a power struggle with those actors whose very survival depends on continued fossil fuel use, because they are fighting back. They are fighting actively to maintain the status quo, and we have to fight back.
Okay, thank you.
I have a very short question to Mr. Huema, who I think is, if I understand correctly, a representative for SMEs here, which is a rare occasion for us to someone to talk to. So I would be really interested in why this fear of non-growth. Why? Because you were saying you need growth. Because I often talk to small entrepreneurs or middle SME entrepreneurs, and very often I get the answer they don't really want to grow, actually. They just want their business to go well. And and those who do say they want to grow, they say they are doing it, they want it because so no one can do them any harm anymore from the other evil competitors. So is it that you are afraid, or is it some fear that you don't even know that exists?
Good question.
Okay. Yes, and then there. Yeah.
It's a suggestion or question, however you want to frame it. My background's in livelihoods and market systems, mostly in developing countries, but systems and complexity has been mentioned a lot, so I suppose it's just from my own experience that it's not just identifying the problem, but how you develop the organizational structure or structures to come up with the solution could be just as problematic. And the idea of complexity being that you come up with analysis and then you keep on analyzing as you go along, so you sort of build the plane while you're flying it, is the analogy oftentimes goes. So I suppose it's more just a concern that trying to build something perfect or using a specific term like degrowth or post-growth, getting something moving and then seeing what works is sort of probably more important, given that everyone's telling us that today is the day to start.
Okay. Thank you. Yes, please.
I want to throw the elephant in the room question into this conference, and I already asked it yesterday by Twitter, and so it's a bit of a provocative statement. But I give a little bit of my background, otherwise you probably won't understand. I worked for the European Greens in the Parliament. I worked as the editor-in-chief of Euractiv, later on as European Director of Global Footprint Network with Matthijs Wackernagel. And my last 7 years I worked with the ETUI, the European Trade Union Institute, and by the way, there is a follow-up conference tomorrow. But the provocative question I asked yesterday about what I say is the elephant in the room is, if we want to have the good life that we're leading in the West, and we want all 7 to 8 billion people to have that kind of lifestyle, do you actually know what it means? Do we actually understand? I think this was a great conference, by the way. Let there be no mistake. And I would like to thank all the parties who actually helped organize it. But the thing is, when I'm in this room, it confirms my view that we all do not really understand what planetary limits really means. Because if we actually want to have the lifestyle of the West for everybody, it will exceed in incredible numbers. Okay. It's totally impossible. And I would like to refer to a recent study done by the Leeds University by Dan O'Neill that Giorgio certainly knows, which actually has done the calculation. There's only one country that comes close to being kind of in this rather high lifestyle and on the other hand a low. You know which country it is? It's Vietnam. Okay? All right, that says enough. Thank you.
Okay, yes, please.
I have two questions. One goes for the Commission. Is it possible somehow to keep track with your changes or ideas you will hopefully implement? And the other one is for the panel and Commission. So we raised a lot of ideas, and hopefully some people will join some movements or even found some initiatives. We should really have a close look that if ideas or groups want to do something and a movement starts from the right and a movement starts from the left, that they cooperate and that not people want the same thing but struggle with some topics and just leave it because they can't handle it alone, so that we really should cooperate together and find solutions together.
Okay. Yes, please.
Thank you. Federico De Maria from Research and Degrowth. I was one of the promoters of the open letter with Yorgos Kallis. My point is on the follow-up. So I would like to thank Philippe Lamberts and the other MEPs, together with the other organizations who supported EEB, Friends of the Earth, the trade unions, and so on, and also the people who are not visible. For example, like Olivier de Ruin, who is sitting there at the computer, who I know did a lot of work. I was here with François Schneider 10 years ago in 2007 for the Beyond GDP conference at the European Parliament. It was a disaster. There was very mild talk on how to improve indicators. We wanted to organize a degrowth conference in the Parliament, and I think we made it. There was a lot of work that has been done in these 10 years, and I think the degrowth movement managed to do something. I think it managed to raise awareness, and I think what we managed is to gain legitimacy to raise the kind of questions that we are raising, which is questioning growth. And I think this is important. So what I'm thinking now is, what should we do for the next 10 years? I think this is the question. The reason why I'm happy now is because I see that we have discovered new allies, which are the MPs and the other organizations who were part of the organization of this conference. I think we learned a lot. I think there was a lot of difference with the people who came from the Commission, which I appreciate their courage, and I think we should follow up with them maybe in closed doors also and ask them what they really think about these questions. I think they're probably closer to us than what they can say in public. And I think this is an important debate. There are many issues we can discuss: how to build a constituency for the political parties, how to promote the growth within the parties and the parliaments, and how to democratize the European Union in general. So my is a wish and an invitation to continue this collaboration. You called for the degrowth people to come. We came. We are here. Many of us stand in the room. We are going to be here the next 10 years and the next decades. And we are happy if you want to be with us. If you want to be together, we can be together in the struggle. Thank you very much for your courage.
It's just okay. Well, I think we have time for one more. And I'm sorry. Yeah, you were a speaker yesterday. I'm sorry. I'm just so maybe very short. And
I've got two very short practical things. Look, as Greens here, we are incredibly strapped for time. I mean, we've got 30 pieces of legislation just in the Economics Committee between 4 MEPs before the end of the mandate. The main thing we don't have is time. So what we love is people who bring us really neat packaged ideas that we can slot into the work that we're doing. I feel that this conference is a very long way away from that. I'll tell you who does do that. It's big oil, it's big corporations, it's people who pay lobbyists to do that. So anything you can do to help with that is really useful. And another practical suggestion would be, why don't some of the people here come and do a week's work shadowing? If you want to know more about how the politics works and put yourself in our shoes and see make what you're trying to do practical by relating it to our work, I think that would be something we might take forward as well.
Wow, that's an offer. Okay. I'm sorry. I think we have to now go back to the panel to give them an opportunity to react, and maybe after there can be a continued conversation. So, Carlos, I turn to you, and I ask to react in maximum 5 minutes.
I will try. I mean, and the questions were very interesting, and I will try to react to several of them, not all of them, by saying first that we have no answers. And that's the first step. When I talk about changing our mindset, when I talk about going in depth to the foundations of our society, that means we will not have the answers, the ready-made answers. And changing a paradigm comes at a cost. We will probably have to go through what my colleague of the club calls, Nora Bateson calls, that precious moment of hopelessness. When you realize the size of the challenge, but you don't have the answers, because if you answer too fast, you are answering with the old frameworks, with the frameworks, the conceptual frameworks you have to get rid of. So sorry, we don't have the answers. As I said at the beginning, we try to ask better questions. The second point, I cannot agree more. I like that I heard several times expressions with which I resonate. One is blind spot, and the other one is elephant in the room, which is more or less the same. I cannot agree more with you. We have no idea what it means. We have no idea what it means. So when I talk about high well-being at low footprint, I'm absolutely sure that doesn't mean to bring to every person on earth the Western lifestyle. But we are trapped in our aspirations in looking at the leisure class, Veblen, remember, in our aspirations, we look at the leisure class. That will not be possible to have the Western lifestyles all over the planet. So high well-being at low footprint, that's a challenge of civilization, nothing less than that. We have to change our civilization deeply. Third, talking about a blind spot and an elephant in the room, I think economics is a major blind spot. Economics, how is it taught today and how is it mainstream economics is a blind spot. So if I had to start changing, if I had the power to start changing something, I would change economics the way it is taught. I'm not saying we should get rid of everything or throw anything to the bin. I would just say let's look at other economics, other theories of how economy works, not only the mainstream, sometimes called, I don't like the word, neoliberal economics, Because, let's be honest, we are in a political institution, sorry to be a bit provocative, but I think, of course, politics is key. That has been said also by somebody. Politics is key, but politics committed suicide in the West in the 80s. Politics committed suicide in the West in the 80s, sorry. And I'm not finger pointing and blaming anybody. There's the fact of society, we did that. We started saying that politics and the state were not so important. What was important was the market and technologies, etc., etc. And this left a wide field for a particular way of conceiving reality and in particular a particular way of conceiving economics to occupy a field which is now, sorry to say so, but it's a trap for politicians. We have many, many blind spots in how politics and policies are conceived nowadays because there are some dogmas which cannot be touched. And as an example, and I will finish with that, regarding the promotion of other styles of entrepreneurship and why they don't grow and why they are still very marginal, there is an instrument that we have, that we still have in all developed countries, which is the power of the state as a buyer. Procurement policies. The state in any developed countries is more or less half of the economy. But we are not using the procurement power of the state to implement the policies we want to implement. So, are we buying renewable? Are the states in the European Union buying only renewable energies? Thank you.
Thank you. Georgios.
Yeah, there is some discussion whether we should talk about degrowth, post-growth, or growth agnosticism. I would say, to the extent that we talk with the European Union or with institutions that the idea of growth is very entrenched, I wouldn't mind that much how we talk. That's why the letter you saw was signed by a broad array of people, of scientists, with which we don't necessarily agree on that question. For example, with Kate Raworth, whose work I admire, we had a disagreement. She was saying I wouldn't use the word degrowth. She preferred donut. I prefer degrowth. But it's decroissance, it sounds like...
Speak up a bit there.
Yes, so there was a little bit, there is, let's say, an internal disagreement, but I don't think that's the most important disagreement to discuss right now. There is something, though, important to discuss, which is to the extent that there is a disagreement of substance that might affect what we are arguing here. And as I said, one of the principal arguments of those of us who talk about the growth is that we want to really uproot the imagination of growth and the insistence on this imagination. So when I hear insistence on the, it's GDP the problem, but something else can grow well, or we can have growth of immaterial stuff, etc. For me, there are alarms there, because I hear the same logic of total expansion, an effort to salvage it by people that I know that in principle are against it. So I think this is an important discussion to have there, and I will insist that it's important to keep making arguments why this is not the case. So if I was to make an argument why it's not possible to just grow good things and this way think that the economy or the type of economy we have right now will keep growing. For example, we talk about services, a service economy. Europe is a service economy. We have 70% services. out of our output. Some economies have 80 to 90% services. There is no sign that this has led to any reduction of resource use. Resource use has increased in line with the increase of services. The idea that somehow we can dematerialize. Let's talk about the specific technologies, how this will happen, whether these technologies will still also manage to create more and more. I'm really skeptical. All the specifics I've seen do not point to this direction. For me, I understand dematerialization using less materials. If we seriously think that we're going to use like 0 of those, we're going to fly like one time out of 2 or 5 years or never. You know, we're going to use the car one time 10 times less. We're going to use 1/100th of the aluminium we use now. This I understand as dematerialization. But if you tell me that this can happen with an economy that keeps expanding, I start being skeptical, you know, because I think we are reproducing fantasies that we have to set out. There is the idea that we want to grow the good things, but to grow the bad things. Of course, I agree with that. But again, I would say, let's not let growth come back into the direction. No, we need to flourish good things. Like here, we need to grow the care sector. No, we don't need to grow the care sector. We don't need to have more and more sick people. No, we have to take good care. Good care. It's not my joke. It was Giacomo's over there over lunchtime, so I stole it from him. So I laughed also when I first heard it. So we need to have better quality of services, no? Better quality of care. We need to have more public parks. We need to have more public spaces. But this is not growth. Why do we keep using this term? I even argue that we shouldn't use the term personal growth, you know. People, when I say that, even people who are very friendly say, no, personal growth is really important. Why growth? Why would you call it growth, you know? Yeah, I think this idea of growth is coming from the economics and has colonized everything we tend to think about. Like, our personality doesn't grow. In what sense does it grow? Can anyone grow that a personality grew from 3 to 6? No. Our personality changes over time. Our care, the way we care for one another changes, becomes different, becomes more beautiful. Why this quantitative way of thinking is coming from economics. It's coming from a very particular way of thinking that it's a problem right now. And I think we should abandon it COC, as we say, no? One way or the other. Can it be appropriated, this discourse? And I wanted to say, someone said that it's part of a system, no? Obviously it's part of a system. That's why it's not enough to say just we're not going to pay attention to growth. We're going to have alternative indicators. We're just going to measure things differently. No, there is a system that does it, you know? In the 30s, the system was working the same way, was producing the same problems, growth and destruction, etc., and taking materials from the colonies, and it wasn't measuring it in GDP, but it was doing it anyway. So it's not the point how just you measure it. It's like, how does the system work? This is what I have to question. Can it be appropriated? We have to be careful. I think everything can be appropriated, no? Socialism was one idea, and it was appropriated one way. You know how it was meant. It was appropriated also in a very ugly, very different way by other people. So there's nothing that cannot be appropriated. There's no idea that cannot be appropriated. We have to be careful how we structure it, how we structure our discourses, and when there is this appropriation, to confront it. Is there an effort to appropriate the idea of the growth, as you said, by the opposite forces? I haven't seen it. The only example I saw was Sarkozy at some point 7, 8 years ago when there was zero growth in France. He said, no, don't worry, but we are all still happy, you know. So he made this kind of argument. So we should be careful. We should be careful there, you know. That's why we're saying it's not just about being happy with 0% GDP growth, but it's about something very, very different.
Okay, I would just... I just want to say, it's passing by me, that I'm not sitting here as the Commission. I work, indeed, for the Commission in the Joint Research Centre. I've been asked to step in to moderate the session. I really don't feel, I'm not entitled, and I didn't think of answering in the name of the Commission, so I will leave the question there if you allow, and I hope I can help you to get one if you wish, but not now. So with that, I pass the floor to Georges. To Gerhard, sorry. The G was...
I would like to start with the observation you made about the small local initiatives. I think in the end of the day, most of our micro-enterprises absolutely the same situation. Yeah? We are suffering from red tape. We are suffering from regulation which are much easier to implement by large companies. We are suffering from unfair competition created by these imbalances in the environment, regulatory environment for the economy. And I think this would be an important thing that together with the Parliament in future we gain progress here. Because from the 24 million SMEs in Europe, more than 23.5 are micro-enterprises with an average of 5 employees. These are this local economy, and these are the companies, and I agree, many of them don't want to grow. But this does not mean if one company doesn't want to grow, that there is a need for growth, not in your sense, but in the sense that to provide sufficient services and goods for these people. And what is the answer to this big elephant in the room? Yeah? Should we go down now to have all of us only Vietnam living standards? Or should we keep our living standard and keep the others down? Who is deciding this in a democratic world? If we implement rules that maybe something becomes more expensive, if it's dangerous for the environment or has a big environmental footprint, do we really think that will decrease inequality? If you forbid low-cost carriers and only rich people can go to Barcelona anymore, do you think that's a step forward? I am not so sure it is the right direction. And what I want to say is that we SMEs are interested in long-term stable developments. Yeah? We, our family businesses, are more interested in sustainability than managers which only look to the next quarter figures. We are also innovative and we are local, but we can only go this way with you, let's put it in this way, if it's realistic developments and if there are realistic step forwards, and not, you will not get our support for do a big revolution. That will not happen. Hopefully we are not coming to this dramatic situation, was mentioned by Carlos, that we have to change everything in our thinking. I am still think we can find a solution without a total revolution and another big societal cultural clash. Thank you.
Thank you. And I want to thank you all for all what you've put in this closing session, because now I'm happy to hand over to Philippe Lamberts for the closing of the conference.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So first, I'd like to thank, of course, my colleagues, MEPs, who helped us put this conference together, to their teams, to the personnel of the European Parliament who supported us, and of course all the speakers, and especially you, who participated actively in this conference. And of course there's one person, and he was already mentioned, so Olivier, please stand up. Without Olivier, this would not have happened. Olivier has been, I think, growing a few grey hair over the last few months, putting this thing together, and well, I think it was 80% of his working time since the beginning of the year. So that is an achievement. So second, I'd like to say that me and I think most of us do not underestimate the gravity of the situation. If we let inequalities and or ecological impact run away, as they are going on their course, what is at stake is the existence of our societies. And yes, Gerhard, I would say that realism commands us to look at reality as it is. What is at stake is the possible extinction of our societies, starting with democracy. I read over the summer, and by the way, it was advised to me when I was in Budapest at one of your conferences. I read Polanyi this summer. And indeed, the commodification of nature, of people and of currency is submitting the entire society to the logic of the market. That is, to the logic of short-term profit maximization. That is the reality. That is what we are up against. So yes, someone said, well, there's a power logic behind this. Absolutely. This system is working to the benefit of a number of people, and that number is shrinking every year. But it uses this religion of growth to basically maintain its power. And it's a powerful religion. I mean, this religion of growth is very powerful indeed. Otherwise, it would have been extinct already. So we know what we are up against. So we do not underestimate the gravity. And what we did, and that's my third point, what we did the last 2 days, and well, it started actually on Monday and it ends only tomorrow, is part, in my view, of a two-pronged strategy. Someone said, well, there's elections next year. And yes, if there's one thing I want to grow is the influence of people who are thinking the way I think most of us think in the Parliament. Because the good news, and I said that I think yesterday, is that, well, we do have influence. I mean, the European institutions have power. Otherwise, we would not be lobbied as we are. Why would they spend money on trying to influence us if we didn't have the power? We do have it. Good news. Now, of course, if the majorities remain as they are today, do not expect any major shift in policy making. So yes, one arm of the strategy is really to shift the power balance within the democratic institutions. But there's another part of the strategy, and this is where this conference belongs. I had a workshop this afternoon where Marco Butti, Director General of the Economic and Financial Directorate General of the European Commission, spoke, and he said you should not underestimate the questions that are being asked or the doubts that are being raised even in this citadel of power that is the Brussels bubble. And that is true. And so, yes, we have a frontal strategy where we want to increase our power. That's sure. We want other numbers, because other numbers would have killed CETA, for instance, this trade treaty with Canada, and we were not far from being able to win that one. So that's one part, but also we want to engage into those who actually come, because they are also realists sometimes, to the realization that, well, if we look at inequality, if we look at our ecological impact, all policies are not delivering what we say we want them to deliver. And I want to exploit these openings, these cracks in the fortress of the pensée unique, as I like to call it. And this is what we have been doing the last 2 days. And if I am, and that's my fourth point, if I do not underestimate the gravity of the situation, actually I told you when I opened this conference that it was a joy to open it. And indeed, if I look around me, there's many reasons to despair, to think that it's already too late, that all the signs of potential collapse of our society, starting with the collapse of democratic institutions, are there. But conversely, there's many signs of hope. I see them in society because I see the multiplication of initiatives, citizens' initiatives, initiatives by companies as well, initiatives by trade unions, initiatives by all sorts of people in society who are actually trying to invent the future now, not in the future, and that gives me hope. And the very fact that we could hold this conference, because Federico, you said, okay, we have this beyond growth or beyond GDP 10 years ago, and well, I think that this conference had more impact than what we had 10 years ago. The fact that you have senior people from the Commission engaging shows that there's appetite for looking at other kinds of solutions. And I'm like you, Gerhard. I'm a reformist. Because I also know that violent disruption will probably not give the desired results, that we will end up in a worse place. But again, do not underestimate the fact that the system maintains itself through violence as well. Violence made to nature, violence made to people. And so I want to upset the system by reform, not by violence. But we should not underestimate the degree of violence. So let me finish by my fifth point, and that's the next steps. Of course, there's an immediate one. Tomorrow, in the European Trade Union House in Brussels, we will close these 4 days. And I think it will be a moment to take stock. But let me make one commitment. It's not certain yet that I will be part of the next European Parliament, but if I am, I commit to one thing. This dialogue will continue, and I'm sure that there's like-minded MEPs here who want to make the same commitment. So I think that it's unrealistic to have the next installment of this dialogue in 2019, because this is election year, but I think it would be a very appropriate time to meet again in the spring of 2020. Why is that? Because after the election of the European Parliament, you have the election of the new Commission. And that new Commission will then have an agenda. The Commission will be elected and put in place towards the end of 2019. So I think spring 2020 is a good moment if we want to influence the agenda. And that would be my commitment to you, that we will meet again by that time. And so one request to you. We cannot invite you to discuss about the feedback to this event, but if you have, and some of you did, any suggestions as to how to shape the next installment of this conversation, we are welcoming these suggestions. Olivier would be, of course, the one to collect your input, but do not hesitate. And I'm sure that we can make it better next time over. So with that, I think I can close the conference. Thank you.